Before Adam breathed, before the garden existed, before any human eye saw the light, there was a world, a complete world, inhabited, governed, and then destroyed. Not by accident, by judgment. The waters that cover the oceans today are not merely water. They are the tomb of an era that God erased, and whose fragments still whisper between the lines of the scriptures for those who have ears to hear. Subscribe for more videos like this. But before continuing, subscribe for more videos like this. Continuing. If this content is touching you in some way, I want to make you a very special invitation. We have prepared an ebook with 60 prayers to say in your daily life. They are practical, direct, and powerful prayers, designed to strengthen your faith, open paths, bring protection, health, and prosperity to your routine. It is at a promotional value, and the link is in the pinned comment below. In addition to helping you spiritually every day, when you purchase the ebook, you also help keep this channel active, allowing us to continue bringing daily videos like this to you. So take a look at the pinned comment, access the link, and guarantee yours while it is at the special value. And of course, now if this type of content makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel now. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming messages. Let us continue. You probably grew up hearing that the Bible begins with the creation of the world. That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything was good, and everything was new. But there is a fracture in the text that almost no one stops to observe with attention. A crack between two verses that, when examined closely, reveals something much older, much more disturbing, and much more glorious than the story you know. What existed before the Garden of Eden? What was there before the man of clay? What did God create, govern, judge, and destroy before Adam opened his eyes for the first time? The answer lies there, hidden in the silence between verse 1 and verse 2 of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. And when you understand what this silence hides, your reading of the scriptures will never be the same. Genesis 1:1 is one of the best-known phrases in the entire Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. 7 words in Hebrew. Majestic, absolute, definitive. But the following verse presents a scenario that completely contradicts the idea of a perfect creation coming from the hands of a perfect God. The earth was without form and void. There was darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Think of the scenario for a moment. A God who is light creates something shrouded in darkness. A God of order creates something without form. A God who declares that everything is good creates something that is empty. This makes no sense. Unless verse 2 is not describing the act of creation, but rather the result of a judgment. Unless between verse 1 and verse 2 something happened, something enormous, something that the Bible records in a veiled way, scattered in fragments through Ezekiel, Isaiah, Job, the Psalms, and the New Testament, as if God had left the clues there purposely, waiting for whoever was willing to put the pieces together. This debate is not new. Throughout more than 2,000 years, Jewish scholars and early Christians already raised this question. It received a formal name in recent centuries, the interval theory, or in English, the gap theory. And although it is rejected by some sectors of conservative theology, it is grounded in textual, linguistic, and prophetic evidence that deserves to be taken seriously, not as a replacement for faith, but as a deepening of it. Because the Bible is not a book that fears questions, it is a book that provokes them. The prophet Isaiah, in his chapter 45, verse 18, writes something that few connect to this debate. He says that God did not create the earth to be empty, but to be inhabited. The Hebrew word used for empty in this verse is the same word used in Genesis 1 and 2, tohu, empty, without form, chaotic. If God declares that he did not create the earth to be tohu, then why in the second verse of the Bible does it appear exactly like that? The logical answer is, because something happened after the original creation and before the moment described in verse 2. Something transformed what was inhabited into something empty. Something transformed what was ordered into something chaotic. And this something has a name. Before speaking about what existed in this previous world, it is necessary to speak about who governed it, because there was no world without a governor, and the governor of this world was not a man. He was a being of a completely different order, created before the earth, before the oceans, before time as we know it. His original name remains shrouded in mystery and translation, but Ezekiel describes him in details that leave any reader breathless. In chapter 28 of Ezekiel, the prophet writes a lament addressed to the king of Tyre. But from verse 12, the language changes completely. It surpasses any human king and begins to describe a being that existed before humanity. Ezekiel says that this being was the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and complete in beauty, that he was in Eden, the garden of God, that he was covered with precious stones from the day he was created, stones that scholars identify as being the same 12 stones of the breastplate of the high priest of Israel, that he was the anointed cherub, the one who covered, and that God had placed him on the holy mountain of God. Think of this. It is not a description of a human king. It is the description of a celestial being of high hierarchy, designated by God for a position of government and protection over the original creation. Isaiah takes up this figure in chapter 14. There, he uses a devastating poetic image. How art thou fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn! How art thou cut down to the ground which didst weaken the nations? And then comes the phrase that reveals the sin. Thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. 5 declarations of I will. 5 moments in which self-will replaced the will of the Creator. It was not disobedience through ignorance. It was rebellion through ambition. And this rebellion had consequences that echoed through the entire structure of the cosmos. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Content like this is produced every week to help you understand the deepest layers of the scriptures. Subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss any episode. But let us return to the previous world. If there was a being of such greatness governing the creation, then there was also a creation to be governed. And here the scriptures offer fragments that, when gathered, form an impressive picture. The book of Job, in chapter 38, brings one of the most enigmatic passages in the entire Bible. God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind and asks, Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The sons of God, beings that existed before the creation of the earth and who celebrated it with songs. This points to a vast, active and organized angelic order that pre-existed humanity, a celestial hierarchy that inhabited the domains created before man and that witnessed the laying of the foundations of the world itself. Consider the scale of this. We are not talking about a solitary angel or a small group of spiritual beings. We are talking about a complete cosmic reality, with orders, hierarchies, purposes, and perhaps even spiritual civilizations functioning for eras before any human ancestor existed. And at the center of this reality was a being who was described as the anointed cherub who covered, a being who walked among the stones of fire, according to Ezekiel, a being who had access to the very throne of God, and this being chose rebellion. The fall of this being was not silent, it was catastrophic, and it is here that the interval between the verses begins to make sense. When Lucifer, which means morning star or son of the dawn, declared that he would elevate himself above God, judgment was not long in coming. And this judgment did not hit only the rebellious being, it hit the world he governed. The scriptures describe this being cast as profane from the mountain of God, as being destroyed from among the stones of fire. The language is of total banishment, of cosmic fall, of the collapse of an entire order, and if the governor fell, what happened to what he governed? Psalm 104, verses 5 to 7, brings an image that most commentators interpret as part of the original creation, but that scholars of the gap theory see differently. Verse 7 says, At thy rebuke the waters fled, at the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. The word rebuke there is the same used in other contexts to describe divine judgment. Not a simple creational order, a rebuke, a punitive act, as if the waters that covered the earth in the state described in Genesis 1 and 2 had arrived there as a consequence of a decree of judgment, not as the original state of creation. The picture that emerges is this: God created a perfect world, inhabited by spiritual beings under the leadership of the anointed cherub. This world existed for a period that the scriptures do not quantify with precision. It may have been a brief period. It may have lasted for unimaginable eras. We simply do not know. But at a certain moment, the rebellion of Lucifer provoked a judgment that destroyed the order of that world. The earth became without form and void. Darkness covered the deep. The waters engulfed everything. And there was the state of the earth when the Spirit of God began to hover over the waters, awaiting the next act of history. Observe what happens in verse 2 with attention to the Hebrew language. The verb used for was out in the passage, the earth was without form, is haya. And in Hebrew, haya can mean both to be and to become. There are scholars who argue that the most precise translation would be, the earth became without form and void. It was not born that way. It became that way. The distinction is fundamental because it implies a process, a change of state, a before and an after. And this after is what we see in verse 2, the result of a judgment upon a creation that had been perfect and that fell along with the being who should have protected it. But what exactly was in this world? Here the scriptures are more reserved, which in itself is significant. God did not leave a detailed report of the pre-Adamic world, perhaps because this was not the focus of the revelation intended for humanity. But the fragments exist. In Jeremiah 4, verses 23 to 26, the prophet has a disturbing vision. He describes what he sees. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down. Scholars observe that Jeremiah's language here uses the same words as Genesis 1 and 2, without form and void, tohu and bohu, and a detail. He mentions ruined cities, not forests, not empty oceans. Cities. What does this mean? Subscribe to this channel if you are enjoying this deep dive into the scriptures. Each episode is an invitation to see the Bible with new eyes. Click subscribe and be part of this community. Jeremiah's vision can be interpreted as a vision of the future judgment upon Judah, and many commentators make exactly that reading. But the language deliberately echoes Genesis in a way that makes some scholars see there a window into the previous world. Cities that existed before the recreation, structures that were ruined by divine judgment, a civilization, perhaps spiritual, perhaps of a nature different from anything the human mind can easily conceive, that existed and was destroyed before the first man was formed from the dust of the earth. And the waters covered everything. The abyss swallowed what had been built. And therefore, in the scriptures, the sea is always associated with chaos, death, judgment, and the unknown. It is not a poetic coincidence. It is a spiritual record. The ocean is the tomb of the previous world, and that is why it is so vast, so unexplored, so mysterious. Humanity today knows the surface of Mars better than the Earth's own ocean floors. 71% of the planet's surface is covered by water. The oceans average 3,800 meters in depth. And the deepest point ever measured, the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean, reaches nearly 11,000 meters below the surface. A depth so absurd that if you placed Mount Everest inside it, its summit would still be more than 2,000 meters below the surface of the water. All of this has not yet been completely explored, perhaps because what is down there was not meant to be rediscovered. Yet, dimension this scale for a moment. If the oceans are the sepulchre of the previous creation, then we are living upon a tomb of planetary proportions. Every time a ship crosses the Atlantic, every time a child plays on the beach, every time you look at the horizon over the waters, there exists below that surface a reality that the scriptures describe as the abyss, the place of delayed judgment, the place where chaos was imprisoned until the time of the end. And then came the restart. The narrative of Genesis does not present us with a creation out of nothing in chapter 1 from verse 3. It presents us with a recreation, a restoration, a second act. God did not ignore the chaos that was before him. He spoke over it. And when God speaks, reality obeys. The first act of the restart is revealing. Let there be light. Not let there be earth. Not let there be oceans. Not let there be life. The first thing God does over a world plunged in darkness is to bring light, as if the first step to undoing the judgment was to undo the darkness, as if light were the declaration that a new chapter was beginning over the rubble of the old. Over 6 periods, whether literal 24-hour days or longer eras, a question that scholars have debated for centuries, God orders the chaos, separating the waters, making the dry land emerge, creating luminaries, filling the seas with life, filling the skies with birds, covering the earth with animals. And at the end, the highest and most singular act of the entire narrative, God forms a being from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This man was not just another creature, he was a declaration, an answer, a divine bet on a new model of existence. Because in the previous world, rebellion had come from spiritual beings who had full awareness of God and yet chose opposition. Now God creates a different being, a being made of earth and divine breath at the same time. A being that is matter and spirit fused, a being that will need to grow in knowledge, that will have freedom of choice, that can fail and be restored, that can fall and be lifted up. A being for whom grace was woven into the very structure of his existence even before he sinned for the first time. The Garden of Eden was not just a beautiful place. It was an environment designed specifically for this new being. 2 trees in the center, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. 2 symbols that function as a test and as a promise. The tree of life represented dependence on God as the source of existence. The tree of knowledge represented the temptation to assume divine autonomy, to become like God, to repeat exactly what the being of the previous world had done. Have you ever stopped to think that the temptation of Eden was not new, that it had been the same temptation that destroyed the entire world before man existed? The serpent that approaches Eve in the garden was no ordinary snake. It was the vehicle of a being that had passed through a cosmic judgment and who now, moved by the same ambition that had destroyed him, tried to drag the new creation into the same fall. And the phrase used by the serpent is devastating in its familiarity. Ye shall be as gods. It is not a new proposal. It is the echo of an old failure. It is the same voice that had sounded before the earth became without form and void, and this time it found ears willing to listen. But here there is a fundamental difference between the previous world and the world of Adam and Eve. In the previous world, judgment was immediate and total. The earth became empty. Darkness covered the abyss. There was no possibility of restoration for that world within the same cycle. But when Adam and Eve sinned, God did not destroy everything again. He said, "Where art thou?" He went to meet what had fallen. He made garments of skin to cover them. He took them out of the garden not only as punishment, but as protection, so that they would not eat of the tree of life in the fallen state and remain eternally trapped in that condition. And then, still in the same chapter, God pronounced upon the serpent a promise that would change all of history. "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." A promise within a judgment, a seed of redemption planted in the soil of failure. This did not exist in the previous world. The previous world was destroyed without a promise of restoration within that cycle. But the world of Adam and Eve received something that the pre-Adamic creation did not receive: the guarantee that the fall would not be the last word. If you have followed this episode this far, you are part of a minority of people who truly want to understand the scriptures in depth. Subscribe to this channel now, leave your like on this video, and share it with someone who also deserves to know these truths. This helps the channel a lot to continue producing this type of content, because the seed promised in Genesis 3 and 15 was not just a son of Eve, it was the Son of God. It was the Creator himself who would descend into the interior of his creation, assume the form of that being of clay and breath that had failed, live the life that no human being had managed to live, and in the most paradoxical and glorious act of all cosmic history, would die upon a cross to pay the price of the rebellion that had begun before humanity existed. Think of the scope of this. The redemption of Christ was not just a solution to the human problem. It was the resolution of a conflict that predates the visible creation itself. The cross was not an emergency plan. It was the central plan since before the foundation of the world. Revelation calls Jesus the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, not since the fall of Adam, since the foundation of the world. What does this say about the level of anticipation and sovereignty of God in the face of everything that happened? Here something needs to be said clearly. The gap theory is not a dogma. It is not a doctrine established with unanimity among scholars of the Scriptures. There are serious theologians committed to the Word of God who disagree with this interpretation, and who see Genesis 1 and 2 as a coherent narrative sequence without the need to presuppose a previous world. This debate is legitimate and respectable. What this content proposes is not the replacement of certainties with speculations, but an honest opening to a question that the biblical text itself poses. Because the contradiction between Genesis 1 and 1, Isaiah 45 and 18, and the chaotic state of Genesis 1 and 2 is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously by any honest reader of the Scriptures, what we know for certain is this: God is eternal. The world we know has a beginning. Between the eternity of God and the beginning of the world we inhabit, there is an immense space that the Scriptures reveal in fragments. Celestial beings existed before the earth and celebrated it with songs. A being of high hierarchy governed and fell. Evil did not begin in the Garden of Eden. It arrived at the garden with an already long history, and the creation we inhabit is, in some sense, a new chapter, a new attempt, a new scenario set upon the rubble of something that existed and was judged. And at the center of this new scenario, a being made of clay, fragile, vulnerable, limited, with a life measured in decades, not in eras, with a knowledge that is built little by little, not that emerges ready-made, with a nature that feels cold, hunger, pain, longing, fear, a being that seems too small for the role assigned to him, and yet it was upon this being that God placed the boldest bet in all of cosmic history. The possibility of a creature made of dust, inhabited by divine breath, voluntarily choosing communion with the Creator, not by obligation, not by inescapable nature, but by love. The world before Adam and Eve was destroyed because the being who governed it chose rebellion. The world after Adam and Eve will be restored because a man, the second Adam, as Paul calls him in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, chose obedience. Where the first failed, the second prevailed. Where a being of light exalted himself, the Son of God humbled himself. Where rebellion opened an abyss, obedience built a bridge. And this bridge is not made of gold, nor of precious stones like those that covered the anointed cherub. It is made of wood. And upon it were nailed the hands of the only one who had authority to fulfill the promise planted in the soil of the destroyed garden. Observe the divine irony in this narrative. The being who had been covered with precious stones, who walked among the stones of fire, who had been created to reflect the glory of God, chose to exalt himself, and the result was the destruction of an entire world. The being who was made of the dust of the ground, who was formed with the hands of the Creator as a potter forms the clay, who was the last to be created in the sequence of recreation, chose to accept the fall. And the result was the necessity of redemption. But he who came to redeem arrived as the humblest of all, born in a manger, raised in a city without prestige, working as a carpenter for 30 years before beginning his public ministry. And when his ministry reached the decisive moment, he did not flee from death. He walked toward it, because it was the only way to cross what had been destroyed and rebuild what had been promised. Paul says in Colossians 1 and 16 that all things were created by him and for him, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, principalities, powers. All things were created by him and for him. This includes the previous world. It includes the beings that inhabited it. It includes the fall and the judgment. It includes the recreation and the man of clay. It includes the cross and the resurrection. Everything is within the purpose of a single plan that began before the foundation of the world, and that advances toward an end that Revelation describes with images of a beauty that defies human language. A new heaven, a new earth, the sea that exists no more, the presence of God dwelling with men, and the Lamb at the center of everything. The world before Adam was destroyed, but not forgotten. God did not start from zero out of weakness. He restarted by purpose, and at the center of this new beginning, He molded clay, breathed life, and placed a man before a choice. The same choice that previous world failed to make. What does this say about you? That you are not just the product of a creation. You are the bet of a second chance. You exist not despite what happened before, but because of it. Each breath of yours is the continuation of a plan that survived a cosmic destruction. Each dawn that you see is the light that God sent over the chaos, and that has not yet been extinguished. Each choice you make carries the weight of a story that began before you and that goes beyond you. And unlike what came before, you still have time to do differently. The being of light who governed the previous world did not have Calvary. He did not have the promise of the seed. He did not have a lamb slain from the foundation of the world interceding for him. You do. Use this difference. It cost more than any human mind can calculate,